It was a warm afternoon when everything changed. Jasmine, the daughter of a respected judge, had just finished lunch at a local cafe. She was heading back to her car, chatting with a friend about their weekend plans. As she walked down the sidewalk, she noticed a police car parked near the curb. The officer inside, Officer Williams, was known around the neighborhood for his cold attitude. As Jasmine passed by the car, Officer Williams suddenly stepped out, blocking her path. He wasn't smiling, and his tone was sharp. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice loud enough to catch the attention of people nearby. "What's the hurry? Do you know it's illegal to park here?" Jasmine was taken aback. She had parked her car legally, but she wasn't about to argue. "I don't believe I've done anything wrong, officer. I just parked and was walking to my car," she replied calmly. The officer narrowed his eyes, looking at her from head to toe. "I don't care about your excuses. You're wasting my time." Jasmine felt her heart race. She had never been in this kind of situation before. Her father was a judge, and she had grown up respecting law enforcement. But something about this officer's attitude felt wrong. She could see people watching, some of them glancing nervously, unsure of how this would play out. She stepped back, trying to stay composed. "I don't want any trouble, officer. I'll just go back to my car." But instead of letting her go, Officer Williams took a step forward, his expression angry. "Oh, now you think you can just walk away from me." He raised his hand and struck Jasmine across the face. A gasp echoed through the small crowd. Jasmine stumbled back, her cheek stinging from the slap. Her hand flew to her face, and for a moment, she just stood there, shocked. The people watching didn't move, frozen by the sudden outburst. Jasmine could feel her face burning with both the pain of the slap and the embarrassment. How could this happen? She had never imagined this kind of situation, not in a million years. But she wasn't going to break down in front of a crowd. She stood up straight, her back stiffening. Officer Williams was clearly not expecting her reaction. He had thought he could intimidate her into submission, but Jasmine's pride wouldn't let that happen. Instead of retreating, she locked eyes with the officer, her voice steady but firm. "I don't know who you think you are," she said, her words clear, "but you have no right to treat me this way. I'll be sure to report this." The crowd began to murmur, some people starting to pull out their phones, recording the scene. Jasmine knew it was important to stay calm, but inside, she was seething. How dare he lay a hand on her? And worse, how could he think he could get away with it? As the officer stood there, unsure of how to respond, Jasmine took a deep breath. She didn't know it yet, but this moment would set off a chain of events that would change everything, not just for her, but for the officer, and even for the whole community. Jasmine turned, not saying another word, and walked back to her car. But she knew that this was far from over. This was just the beginning. As Jasmine reached her car, her heart was pounding. She quickly opened the door, sitting down behind the wheel, but she didn't drive away immediately. Her mind was racing. She couldn't believe what had just happened. The slap still stung, but it wasn't the pain that hurt the most. It was the humiliation. Jasmine took a deep breath and tried to calm herself. She had grown up in a family where self-control was everything. Her father, Judge Thomas Mitchell, had always taught her to handle situations with grace and dignity, no matter how challenging. She had always believed that respect for others and the law was something that should never be questioned. But now, her world had been turned upside down by an officer who had shown none of that respect. Jasmine reached for her phone and dialed her father's number. He answered quickly, his voice steady and calm, just like always. "Dad, we need to talk," she said, her voice tight with emotion. She tried to hold back the tears that were threatening to fall. She didn't want to sound weak, but the situation was overwhelming. "What happened, Jasmine?" her father asked, his tone immediately changing from calm to concerned. "I was just outside the cafe when Officer Williams stopped me," she began, her voice trembling a little. "He accused me of parking illegally and then he slapped me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jasmine could hear her father's breath catch, but he didn't say anything right away. He was processing what she had said. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," Jasmine replied, though her voice still shook. "I'm not hurt. But it wasn't just the slap. It was how he treated me. I didn't do anything wrong, and he just hit me for no reason." Her father took a deep breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. He had been a judge for many years and had seen his fair share of injustice, but this was personal. His daughter, the person he cared about most, had been hurt by someone who was supposed to protect and serve the community. "I'm going to take care of this, Jasmine," he said, his voice steady but with an edge of anger. "I need you to stay where you are. Don't go anywhere. I'll handle it from here." Jasmine nodded, even though she knew her father couldn't see her. "I'll stay here. Just, please do something." "I will. Just stay calm. I'll be there soon." As she ended the call, Jasmine couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. She knew her father would take care of things. But at the same time, she felt a deep sense of unease. She had never experienced anything like this before. What would happen next? How would this impact her father's reputation and career? Would people believe her? Jasmine knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But one thing was certain. She wasn't going to let Officer Williams get away with what he had done. She had always believed in justice, and now she was about to see if that belief would hold true when it came to her. As the minutes ticked by, Jasmine looked out her window and saw the same officer standing near his car. He hadn't moved, still unaware of the storm that was about to hit. But things were about to change. The truth would come to light, and Jasmine would make sure of it. The minutes after Jasmine left the scene felt like hours. Her mind was still spinning, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. But she wasn't alone in her thoughts. People who had witnessed the confrontation were still standing nearby, quietly discussing what they had just seen. Some were shaking their heads in disbelief, while others couldn't stop talking about how unfair and wrong it had been. A small crowd had gathered around the scene. They were mostly bystanders who had been walking by, but now they found themselves caught up in the aftermath of a police officer's actions. Some had even pulled out their phones to record what had happened. Jasmine could tell that many of them had been too shocked to react in the moment, but now they were trying to make sense of the event. "I can't believe that happened," one of the women in the crowd whispered to her friend. "He just slapped her like it was nothing." "Who does that?" "I know, right?" her friend replied. "And she didn't even do anything wrong. I've seen her around before. She's always so polite and respectful." Others were just as shocked but remained silent, unsure of what to do next. It wasn't every day that a police officer acted so aggressively in public, especially towards someone who wasn't causing any trouble. The crowd didn't know Jasmine personally, but they could tell that something wasn't right. As the murmurs continued to grow, one of the men in the crowd, a local business owner, walked up to Officer Williams. His face was serious, and his voice steady as he spoke. "Officer, that was unnecessary. I don't care who she is. You had no right to slap her," he said firmly. The officer turned to face him, looking surprised at the challenge. "Mind your own business," Officer Williams snapped, his tone harsh. "I'm doing my job." But the man wasn't intimidated. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to treat people like that. She didn't even argue with you, and you went straight to violence. You should be ashamed of yourself." A few others in the crowd nodded in agreement. The tension in the air grew as more people started to speak out, their voices growing stronger with each passing minute. "It's not just about what happened to her," one woman said. "It's about what this officer represents. People like him make everyone feel unsafe, and that's not okay." A few bystanders stepped forward to express their outrage, while others stood back, still processing what they had just witnessed. Some began to pull out their phones, filming the officer as he stood there, unsure of how to respond to the growing number of people challenging him. Meanwhile, Jasmine stayed in her car, watching the scene unfold. It was a strange mix of emotions for her. relief that people were standing up, but also a deep sense of anger. She wasn't the only one who had seen what happened, and now it seemed like others were just as determined to make sure the officer was held accountable. For a few moments, Officer Williams seemed to stand tall, his face flushed with anger as he tried to maintain his authority. But the more people spoke up, the more isolated he felt. He had underestimated the power of the community, and now it was too late to take back what had happened. As Jasmine sat in her car, she realized that the officer's actions weren't just about her. They had sparked something bigger. People were beginning to see the truth, and they weren't going to let it go. The support from the crowd made her feel a little less alone. Maybe, just maybe, this was the moment when things would start to change. Back at home, Judge Thomas Mitchell was sitting in his office, reviewing paperwork. The afternoon sun filtered through the window, casting a warm glow over his desk. He had spent most of his day handling legal matters, but everything came to a halt the moment his phone rang. He saw his daughter's name on the screen. His heart skipped a beat, sensing that something was wrong. He answered quickly, his voice steady. "Jasmine, what's going on?" Dad, I need to talk to you." Something happened. Jasmine's voice trembled on the other end of the line. Judge Mitchell's heart raced. He could hear the unease in her tone, and it only took a second for him to know that whatever it was serious. "Jasmine, calm down. What happened?" he asked gently, his mind already jumping to conclusions. She took a deep breath before speaking, trying to keep her emotions in check. "It was Officer Williams. He stopped me while I was walking back to my car and accused me of something I didn't do. I tried to stay calm, but then he slapped me, right there in front of everyone." A heavy silence fell between them. The judge felt a cold anger rise in his chest. He had known Officer Williams for years. The officer had always been polite, though distant, and had been part of the community for a long time. But hearing that his daughter had been slapped, an unprovoked attack, shattered everything. "What?" he finally said, his voice barely a whisper, the shock evident. "He did what?" "I'm okay, Dad," Jasmine said quickly, trying to reassure him. "But I want you to know what happened. I don't know if anyone else will speak up, but I know I need to do something about it." The judge stood up from his chair, pacing the room as he absorbed her words. His mind raced, calculating his next steps. He had spent his career upholding the law, ensuring that justice was served. But now the lines between professional duty and personal responsibility were blurring. His daughter was involved, and no matter what, he would make sure this wasn't swept under the rug. "I'll be there soon, Jasmine," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I want you to stay where you are. Don't go anywhere, and don't speak to anyone about this until I get there." "I'll be here," she said, her voice steady, but the uncertainty still lingered. As soon as they ended the call, Judge Mitchell went straight to his car. The drive to the cafe where Jasmine had been felt like a blur. His thoughts were focused entirely on her safety and the officer's actions. He had to act quickly. When he arrived at the scene, the first thing he noticed was the crowd still gathered around Officer Williams. Some people were filming. Others were speaking to the officer, clearly upset by what had happened. But there was no sign of Jasmine. He marched up to one of the witnesses, a man who had been vocal about the officer's behavior. "Where is she?" Judge Mitchell asked, his voice low but urgent. "She's in her car," the man replied, pointing to the vehicle parked nearby. Without wasting another second, Judge Mitchell walked over to Jasmine's car. She was sitting inside, her face pale but composed. When she saw him approach, she opened the door, relief flooding her face. "Dad," she started, but the judge raised a hand, signaling for her to remain calm. He could see that she was upset, but he needed to focus on the next steps. "We're going to handle this," he said firmly. "Stay close. I'm going to take care of this officer. You don't have to worry about a thing." Jasmine nodded, but her mind was still reeling. She couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would Officer Williams face consequences, or would the system protect him because of his position? But one thing was clear: her father wasn't going to let this go. And for the first time that day, Jasmine felt a sense of hope. Her father had always been her rock, and now she knew he would stand up for what was right, no matter what it took. Officer Williams stood near his car, his arms crossed, looking at the crowd that had gathered around him. His face was tense, and his eyes darted from one person to the next, but he didn't seem to realize the weight of the situation. The crowd had grown since the incident, and more people were joining in to express their shock and frustration. Still, Officer Williams didn't back down. He had always been a man who believed in authority. He had risen through the ranks by following the rules, and he wasn't used to being challenged. He was used to being the one who enforced the law, not the one being questioned. The idea that anyone, let alone a group of strangers, would challenge his actions was foreign to him. He glanced at his watch, waiting for something, or perhaps someone, to diffuse the growing tension. But nothing happened. The crowd continued to murmur among themselves, some people filming, others asking questions. "What's the problem here, officer?" A voice called out from the crowd. It was the business owner who had spoken to him earlier. He was standing with a group of people, all looking toward the officer. Officer Williams turned, his jaw tight. "There's no problem," he snapped, trying to regain control of the situation. "This is all just a misunderstanding. I was doing my job, and some people like to make a scene." But the crowd wasn't buying it. They had seen what happened, and they weren't going to let it slide. Some of them shook their heads in disbelief, while others exchanged frustrated glances. A few people had even stopped recording for a moment, choosing to confront the officer directly. "You call slapping her part of your job?" another voice from the crowd asked. This one was softer, but it held a sharp edge. It was a woman who had been walking by when the incident happened. "How could you do that to someone for no reason? It's wrong." "I wasn't doing anything wrong," Officer Williams replied quickly, his voice growing louder. "She was uncooperative. I told her to stop, and she didn't listen. It's not like I had a choice. She was causing a disturbance." A murmur ran through the crowd. People were exchanging disbelieving looks. They knew Jasmine hadn't done anything to provoke the officer. She had been calm and polite, trying to avoid confrontation. The officer's eyes narrowed. He didn't understand why these people were turning against him. Why weren't they backing him up? Why weren't they respecting his authority? It had always worked like this before. He was the one in control. "I'm just doing my job," Officer Williams repeated, his voice rising, trying to make his actions sound justified. But inside, he could feel the ground shifting beneath him. The anger in the crowd was growing, and he had no idea how to control it. He glanced around, hoping for some sign of support from his colleagues. But there was none. His fellow officers had stayed back, watching from a distance. It was clear they weren't about to intervene. Officer Williams was alone now, and he was starting to realize that his actions had made him a target, not just from the crowd, but from his colleagues as well. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing over his shoulder to see if any of his fellow officers would come to his aid. But the longer he stood there, the more isolated he felt. His bravado started to fade. Deep down, he knew he had crossed a line. And now, the community was making sure he understood the consequences. Jasmine's father, Judge Mitchell, had arrived on the scene, and Officer Williams could feel the tension rise even more. The judge, a respected figure in the community, was standing behind Jasmine, his presence adding weight to the situation. Officer Williams could only wonder what was coming next. Things were no longer just about the slap. They were about what kind of man he had shown himself to be. As Officer Williams stood in the growing crowd, he began to feel a strange sense of unease. The people around him weren't just bystanders anymore. They were challenging his actions, questioning his authority. His confidence, once so strong, was starting to crumble. And then, to his surprise, something even more unsettling began to happen. He noticed that the other officers on the scene weren't rushing to his side. Normally, when something like this happened, his colleagues would have stepped in to back him up. After all, they had worked together for years, and they had always had each other's backs. But today, things were different. The silence from his fellow officers was deafening. Not one of them made a move to support him. Standing at the edge of the crowd, Officer Daniels, one of Williams's longtime colleagues, exchanged a glance with Officer Blake. They had both been there when it happened, and now they couldn't ignore the tension in the air. They had been watching the entire scene unfold, and it was clear they were both uncomfortable with what had happened. Officer Daniels shifted uneasily, his arms folded. He was a man of few words, but he was no stranger to doing what was right. As he stood there, he couldn't help but think about the way Jasmine had been treated. He had seen it too, her calm reaction to the officer's aggression. Jasmine had done nothing wrong, and the slap was uncalled for. Daniels knew he couldn't pretend it hadn't happened, no matter how much he wanted to avoid confrontation. Blake, who had always respected Officer Williams, now looked at him with a mixture of confusion and disappointment. He had seen Williams do things in the past that made him uncomfortable, but he had always chosen to turn a blind eye, telling himself that it wasn't his place to speak out. But now, with the whole community watching and Jasmine's father standing nearby, Blake could no longer ignore what was happening. The situation had escalated, and it wasn't something that could be swept under the rug. "What do we do now?" Blake whispered to Daniels, his voice low but filled with uncertainty. Daniels hesitated, his gaze still fixed on Williams, who was standing alone, facing the crowd. He could feel the shift in the air. The community wasn't going to let this go. And the longer the officers stayed silent, the more they were going to be seen as complicit. "I think we have to do the right thing," Daniels said finally, his voice steady. "We can't just stand here and pretend this isn't happening." Blake nodded slowly, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision. He knew that doing the right thing wouldn't be easy, but it was clear now that the officers' actions had crossed a line. Meanwhile, the crowd's frustration grew. People were no longer just murmuring. Their voices were rising. They were demanding accountability, not just from Officer Williams, but from the entire police force. The onlookers had seen the truth, and they weren't backing down. As the tension thickened, Daniels took a step forward, breaking the silence. He cleared his throat and walked towards Williams. Blake followed closely behind him. The two officers moved slowly but deliberately, their steps measured as they approached their colleague. "Williams," Daniels called out, his voice calm but firm. "You need to step back. This isn't going the way you think it is." Williams turned toward them, his face a mixture of confusion and anger. "What are you talking about?" he snapped, his frustration mounting. "I'm handling this. You've seen what she did. She was disrespectful." Blake shook his head. "No, Williams. We saw what happened. You crossed a line, and now we have to answer for it." The words hit Officer Williams like a cold splash of water. For the first time that afternoon, he truly understood the situation he was in. His colleagues weren't going to back him up. Instead, they were stepping away from him, holding him accountable for his actions. The pressure began to mount, and Officer Williams knew, deep down, that things were about to change. He just didn't know how far it would go. His heart sank as he realized that the support he had always counted on was gone. It wasn't just about the crowd anymore. It was about his colleagues turning away, making it clear that what he had done was unacceptable. And in that moment, he knew that his world was beginning to fall apart. The air was thick with tension as the crowd continued to murmur, eyes fixed on Officer Williams. The pressure was mounting, and Williams could feel it. His heart raced in his chest as he watched Officer Daniels and Officer Blake step back, making it clear that they weren't going to support him this time. He could see it in their faces. They had made their decision. The sound of voices grew louder as more people began to speak up, demanding answers. The people around him, who had once been silent observers, were now challenging him, their voices filled with frustration and anger. But it wasn't just the crowd that was pressing in on him. It was the weight of his own colleagues pulling away from him. He had always believed that they would back him, no matter what. But now, they were making it clear that this time, things were different. Jasmine's father, Judge Mitchell, had been standing on the sidelines, watching the scene unfold. He had been quiet up until now, but as the situation continued to escalate, he knew it was time to act. His daughter had been wronged, and no amount of silence would make this situation go away. Without hesitation, Judge Mitchell walked up to Officer Williams. His face was calm, but there was a clear strength in his eyes. He was a man of the law, a judge who had dedicated his life to upholding justice. And now he was about to hold Officer Williams accountable for his actions. "Officer," Judge Mitchell said, his voice steady and authoritative, "I've been watching what's been happening here, and I want to make something very clear." Williams turned toward him, his face flushed with frustration. "What do you want?" he muttered, trying to maintain some sense of control. "I want to make sure you understand the gravity of this situation," Judge Mitchell replied, his voice unwavering. "You've hurt my daughter, and that is something I won't stand for. But it's not just about that. It's about what this represents." The crowd had fallen quiet as they listened to the judge. Williams shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't speak. He could feel the eyes of everyone on him, and it was beginning to feel like the walls were closing in. "Officer Williams," the judge continued, "you are supposed to serve and protect. But what I've seen today isn't justice. It's an abuse of power. And if you think you can walk away from this without consequences, you're mistaken." The judge's words hung in the air, each one carrying weight. For a moment, there was complete silence. Williams stood there, frozen, realizing that the situation was no longer in his control. The support he had always taken for granted was slipping away. His colleagues had turned against him, and now the community, represented by Judge Mitchell, was holding him accountable. As the crowd began to murmur again, Officer Williams could no longer deny what was happening. His actions had consequences, and now those consequences were unfolding before him. The power he had once wielded so easily was slipping away, and the truth was starting to take hold. Jasmine, watching from her car, felt a sense of relief wash over her. Her father's presence gave her strength. She had always known he would stand up for what was right, but seeing him take charge of the situation made her feel less alone. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about justice for everyone. As Judge Mitchell spoke with quiet authority, more officers began to approach, sensing the shift in the air. Some were watching. Others were beginning to step forward, unsure of what would happen next. They had seen the way things were going. The officer's defiance was no longer going to be accepted, and his actions were going to have real consequences. For the first time in a long while, Officer Williams felt small. The power he had once enjoyed was now in the hands of others. And as the crowd's anger simmered, he realized that his own fate was no longer in his control. The shift had already happened, and now he would have to face the consequences. The tension in the air was thick, and the crowd continued to watch in silence as Officer Williams stood at the center of it all, his mind racing. He could feel the eyes of everyone on him, the bystanders, his fellow officers, and Judge Mitchell, who had made it clear that he would not let this go. He had always believed that no matter what happened, he could count on his colleagues and his position to protect him. But now, in front of everyone, that belief was beginning to crumble. As the minutes passed, more officers arrived at the scene. They had been called in to help, but as they approached, it was clear that they weren't there to support Williams. They had heard the whispers, seen the videos, and felt the growing sense of injustice surrounding the incident. The officers' actions had gone too far, and they could no longer ignore it. Officer Daniels and Officer Blake were among the first to approach. They had already made it clear to Williams that they wouldn't be backing him up, but now they had a bigger role to play. They stood next to Judge Mitchell, who had continued to speak calmly and confidently. Daniels and Blake exchanged glances, knowing what had to be done. "Williams," Officer Daniels said, his voice firm but respectful. "We've discussed this. You've crossed a line, and the department can't stand by while this kind of behavior continues." Williams looked at his fellow officers, the weight of their words sinking in. His heart pounded in his chest, and he knew what was coming. He had hoped that somehow the situation would resolve itself, that the pressure would fade, but it wasn't happening. The truth had come out, and now there was no turning back. "We're going to have to take you in for questioning," Officer Blake said, his voice steady. "There will be an investigation into your actions. You need to understand that." For a moment, Officer Williams just stood there, stunned. He had always prided himself on being above reproach, on doing things by the book. But now, that image was shattered. He was facing an investigation, and the consequences of his actions were going to be serious. He couldn't deny it any longer. He was no longer in control of the situation. His fate was now in the hands of others. The crowd, which had been watching in anticipation, began to murmur once again. People pulled out their phones, capturing the moment as Officer Williams was led away. The scene, which had started with shock and disbelief, had now turned into a moment of justice. For Jasmine, it was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. She had watched it all from her car, and as she saw the officer being escorted away, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. Her father had been right. He had promised to handle the situation, and he had. Jasmine felt a wave of gratitude for the strength her father had shown in standing up for what was right. She knew this was just one small step in the larger fight for fairness, but it was an important one. Judge Mitchell turned to his colleagues who had gathered nearby. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly, his voice filled with determination. "We can't let this kind of behavior go unchecked. There must be accountability." His words echoed in the air, a promise that things would change. It wasn't just about Officer Williams anymore. It was about making sure that everyone was treated with respect, no matter their background. As the crowd began to disperse, the sense of relief in the air was palpable. Officer Williams had been held accountable, and the power had shifted. Justice had been served, but it was clear that this moment would stay with everyone for a long time. For Jasmine, her father's unwavering support had given her hope. For the community, it was a reminder that no one, not even a police officer, was above the law. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft golden light over the quiet street. The crowd had mostly dispersed, but the weight of the day's events lingered. Officer Williams had been taken away, and Jasmine sat in her car, still processing everything that had happened. It felt surreal, like a dream she couldn't fully wake up from. The slap, the crowd, her father's calm authority. It all seemed to happen in a blur. But now, as the world around her returned to normal, she felt a sense of peace. Her phone buzzed, and she looked down to see a message from her father. It read, "You did well today. Justice is always worth fighting for." Jasmine smiled, grateful for her father's support. He had stood by her through everything, and now it seemed like things were starting to settle. The officer was facing an investigation, and the community had spoken out. Jasmine had done her part, and now it was up to the system to decide what happened next. But she knew that no matter the outcome, today was a turning point. Across the street, the police cars had finally begun to leave. Officer Williams had been escorted to the station, and the other officers had returned to their duties, though their expressions were different. The entire scene had shaken them. The truth had come out, and it had forced them to confront their own choices. Some of them, like Officer Daniels and Officer Blake, had taken a stand and made it clear that they wouldn't tolerate such behavior. But others, perhaps, were still struggling with what had unfolded. Judge Mitchell, after making sure his daughter was safe and comfortable, had headed to the courthouse. He knew that the investigation into Officer Williams was just beginning, but he had a feeling that things were going to change. The community had been watching, and they had made their voices heard. This wasn't just about one officer, it was about ensuring that everyone, no matter who they were, was treated fairly and with respect. Back at home, Jasmine sat at her kitchen table, still thinking about everything. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Justice is always worth fighting for. She knew he was right. There would be more challenges ahead, more people to stand up for, and more battles to fight. But she also knew that change was possible. Today had proven that. The news of what had happened spread quickly, and before long, it was the topic of conversation in the community. Local news stations covered the story, and people from all walks of life spoke out in support of Jasmine. They praised her bravery for standing up for herself and demanded that those in power be held accountable for their actions. It was clear that the community had rallied around her, and they were determined to see justice served. In the days that followed, Officer Williams was placed on administrative leave while the investigation continued. The pressure on the police department grew, and discussions about accountability, fairness, and the role of law enforcement in the community gained traction. The story of the SLAP wasn't just about one officer's misconduct, it was about a larger conversation that needed to happen. And now, the community was ready to have it. For Jasmine, the aftermath was bittersweet. She was proud of what had been accomplished, but she knew that there was still work to be done. The fight for justice didn't end here, but it had taken an important step forward. And with her father by her side, she felt ready to face whatever came next. As the days passed, the world slowly returned to its rhythm, but Jasmine would never forget the lesson she had learned, that standing up for what's right could make a difference, and that sometimes justice takes time, but it's always worth fighting for.